A cherry-red Volkswagen Beetle sits idling at the edge of Lake Champlain, its headlights illuminating the early morning mist rolling off the water. The driver's door stands open, keys still in the ignition, the radio playing a Beatles song into the empty Vermont air. A woman's cardigan sweater lies draped across the passenger seat, and a half-finished cup of coffee sits cooling in the cup holder. But Victoria Hayes, the 26-year-old librarian who drove here, is nowhere to be found. This eerie scene greeted State Trooper William Chen at 6:47 a.m. on September 3, 1972. What began as a call about an abandoned vehicle at the Burlington waterfront would spiral into one of Vermont's most perplexing disappearances, a case that would take 47 years to solve and reveal secrets that challenged everything investigators thought they knew about identity, memory, and Cold War intelligence operations. The scene was too perfect, too staged, Trooper Chen would later write in his incident report, like someone had carefully arranged it to tell a story. But what story I couldn't say. The disappearance of Victoria Hayes sent shockwaves through Burlington's tight-knit community. Volunteers searched the wooded trails around Lake Champlain. Divers plunged into the cold depths looking for a body that was never there. Missing persons flyers with Victoria's warm smile appeared in every shop window from Burlington to Montreal. Yet Victoria had vanished as completely as morning fog under the September sun. For nearly 5 decades, the case remained unsolved, the evidence growing colder with each passing year. Theories multiplied: suicide, abduction, voluntary disappearance, even murder. But no one could have imagined the truth, a truth so extraordinary that when it finally emerged in 2019, it would expose a classified government program and reveal that Victoria Hayes had never been one person at all, but rather 3 identical women living as one. Before we dive into this incredible story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. This case is unlike anything you've heard before, and you won't want to miss how this mystery unfolds. Trust me on this one. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how these stories connect people across the globe, reminding us that truth is always stranger than fiction. The story of Victoria Hayes isn't just about a woman who disappeared. It's about the malleability of identity, the power of deception, and the extraordinary lengths governments will go to in the name of national security. It's about 3 women trained from childhood to be one person, and the devastating moment when their carefully constructed fiction began to unravel. This is the story of how modern DNA technology finally pierced through decades of lies, how one determined detective refused to accept that some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, and how the truth, when it finally surfaced, was more astonishing than anyone could have conceived. Tonight we're going back to 1972, to a time when the Cold War cast long shadows and trust was a currency more valuable than gold. We'll trace the decades-long search for answers and reveal the stunning breakthrough that finally brought light to one of Vermont's darkest mysteries. This is a story of deception, identity, and ultimately truth that refused to stay buried. Chapter 1. The Picture-Perfect Life. Burlington, Vermont in 1972 was a city caught between its pastoral past and her uncertain future. Nestled on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain, with the Adirondack Mountains visible across the water, Burlington combined the charm of New England tradition with the energy of a college town. The University of Vermont's presence gave the city a progressive edge, unusual for a place of just 38,000 residents. The early 1970s were turbulent times in America. The Vietnam War continued to divide the nation. The Watergate scandal was beginning to unfold, yet Burlington maintained a certain insulation from these broader upheavals, a community where neighbors still knew each other's names, and the biggest local controversies involved zoning disputes and school board elections. The Fletcher Free Library stood as one of Burlington's architectural treasures, a beautiful Romanesque revival building on College Street that had served the community since 1904. Its reading rooms with high ceilings and tall windows attracted students, retirees, and everyone in between seeking knowledge or simply a quiet refuge from the world. Victoria Hayes had worked at Fletcher Free Library for 3 years, having arrived in Burlington in the summer of 1969. At 26, she was the youngest of the library's professional staff, but quickly earned respect for her organizational skills, her encyclopedic knowledge of the collection, and her genuine warmth with patrons. Standing 5'7", with auburn hair that fell to her shoulders, striking green eyes, and a smattering of freckles across her nose, Victoria had a presence that people remembered. She favored practical but stylish clothing, turtlenecks and corduroy pants in autumn, sundresses in summer, always with comfortable shoes for the hours spent navigating the library's stacks. Victoria had this quality of being fully present when she spoke with you, recalled Martha Henderson, the head librarian, in 1972. Whether you were a professor, researching obscure texts, or a child looking for your first chapter book, she gave you her complete attention. People trusted her. Victoria lived alone in a small apartment on South Willard Street, a 10-minute walk from the library. Her neighbors described her as friendly but private, someone who would wave from her window but rarely invited people in. She attended concerts at the university, browsed the farmers market on weekends, and was known to spend Sunday afternoons at the Church Street coffee shop, always with a book. What struck people most about Victoria was her consistency. She arrived at the library at precisely 8:45 a.m. each workday, 15 minutes before opening. She ate lunch at her desk, usually a sandwich she'd prepared at home. She left at 5:30 p.m., stopping at the grocery store on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Weekends followed similar patterns: library research on Saturday mornings, walks along the waterfront on Sunday afternoons. She was almost too predictable, noted Detective Paul Morrison, who would later review the case files. Looking back, that level of routine seems deliberate, like someone maintaining a careful performance. Despite her warmth with library patrons, Victoria kept her personal life remarkably private. She mentioned no family, cited no hometown with any consistency, and deflected questions about her past with practiced ease. When asked about the holidays, she'd smile and say she preferred quiet celebrations. When colleagues invited her to parties, she'd often decline, citing other commitments that were never specified. The only personal connection anyone knew about was her younger cousin, Margaret Hayes, who lived in Boston and visited Burlington every few months. The two women were clearly close, with Margaret sometimes staying overnight at Victoria's apartment during her visits. September 2nd, 1972 was a Saturday. The library was closed for the Labor Day weekend, giving staff an unusual 3-day break. Victoria had mentioned to Martha Henderson on Friday that she planned to spend the weekend catching up on reading and maybe taking a drive to see the fall colors starting to turn. That Saturday evening, several people reported seeing Victoria at Leuenig's Bistro, a popular restaurant on Church Street. She dined alone, reading a book between courses, and left around 8:30 p.m. The server remembered her as a pleasant customer who left a generous tip. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Victoria was seen at a gas station on North Avenue, filling up her distinctive cherry-red Volkswagen Beetle. The attendant, a college student named David Brooks, remembered the interaction clearly because Victoria asked for directions to Oakledge Park, a waterfront area south of downtown. "I thought it was odd," Brooks told investigators. "It was getting dark, and the park wasn't really a place you'd go alone at that hour. But she seemed completely calm about it. She thanked me for the directions and drove off heading south." That was the last confirmed sighting of Victoria Hayes as herself, but her car would tell a different story. At 6:32 a.m. on September 3rd, an early morning jogger noticed the idling Volkswagen at a pull-off near the lake, about 2 miles south of Oakledge Park. The location was remote, used mainly by fishermen during daylight hours. Concerned by the open door and running engine, the jogger approached carefully, calling out to see if anyone needed help. The car was empty. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the on position. The radio was tuned to a classical music station playing quietly. Victoria's brown leather purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet and identification inside. Her cardigan sweater was draped over the seat back. A thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, still slightly warm. Most peculiar was what sat on the dashboard: Victoria's library employee badge and a folded piece of paper. When Trooper Chen arrived and carefully unfolded the paper, he found a single typed sentence: "I'm sorry, I can't keep living this lie." The scene appeared to be a suicide, a distraught woman leaving a note before walking into the cold waters of Lake Champlain. Yet several elements troubled investigators. There were no footprints leading to the water's edge, despite soft ground from recent rain. Victoria's shoes were still in the car, and the note, while suggestive, was oddly impersonal. No mention of specific struggles, no goodbye to anyone, just that cryptic reference to "this lie." Suicide notes are usually more detailed, noted Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist who would later consult on the case. They reference specific people, express regret about particular situations. This note was almost theatrical in its vagueness. By noon on September 3rd, a full-scale search operation was underway. The Vermont State Police coordinated with local departments, the Coast Guard, and civilian volunteers. Divers explored the lake near where the car was found. Search and rescue teams with dogs combed the shoreline and nearby woods. A helicopter surveyed the area from above. The search continued for 5 days, covering a radius of 10 miles from the abandoned Volkswagen. Not a single trace of Victoria Hayes was found. No clothing, no body, no evidence she'd ever entered the water. The investigation expanded to examine Victoria's life. Detectives interviewed her colleagues at the library, her neighbors, local shop owners who knew her. Everyone painted the same picture: a pleasant, intelligent, slightly reserved young woman who kept to herself but was always kind. No one reported signs of depression or distress. No one could imagine why she would take her own life. Victoria's apartment revealed little. It was neat and simply furnished. Her closet contained a modest wardrobe of practical clothing. Her bookshelves held an eclectic collection ranging from poetry to history to science. But there were no family photographs, no letters, no address book with contacts, no documents predating her arrival in Burlington in 1969. It was like she appeared fully formed 3 years ago, Martha Henderson told investigators. I just assumed she was private about her past, maybe estranged from family. But now, it's like there was no before. Bank records showed Victoria lived within her modest librarian's salary. She had no significant savings, no investments, no property beyond her car and apartment furnishings. She had opened her bank account in June 1969, shortly before starting at the library. Before that date, there was no financial trail. The most puzzling discovery came when investigators tried to verify Victoria's credentials. Her library school degree from Simmons College in Boston checked out. Records showed a Victoria Hayes graduated in 1969, but when investigators contacted the college for more information, they hit a wall. The only record was the degree itself. No application materials, no transcript, no dormitory records, no participation in campus activities. It was as if Victoria Hayes had attended the institution as a ghost, leaving behind only the barest proof of existence. Attempts to locate Victoria's cousin Margaret in Boston proved equally frustrating. No Margaret Hayes matching the description could be found at the Boston address Victoria had occasionally mentioned. In fact, no records existed for anyone by that name in the entire greater Boston area who fit the age and description. We were chasing shadows, Trooper Chen wrote in his case notes. Every thread we pulled led to a dead end or another question. It was becoming clear that Victoria Hayes, whoever she really was, had been living under a carefully constructed false identity. As September turned to October, the search for Victoria's body was officially suspended. The case was reclassified from potential suicide to suspicious disappearance, possibly abduction. Theories multiplied. Had Victoria been running from something in her past? Had she staged her own disappearance? Or had someone else staged it after harming her? The cryptic note, "I'm sorry, I can't keep living this lie," took on new significance. What lie? Who was Victoria really? And where had she gone? For the people of Burlington, particularly those at Fletcher Free Library, the disappearance left a haunting absence. They had lost a colleague, a friend, someone they thought they knew. The revelation that her identity might have been false made them question their own judgment. How well do we ever really know anyone? What time are you watching this? Late-night mystery fans, I see you. There's something about these deep conspiracies that just hits different when the world outside is quiet and dark. As 1972 drew to a close, Victoria Hayes had become another unsolved mystery. Her cherry-red Volkswagen sold at police auction, her apartment rented to new tenants, her position at the library filled by someone new. The investigation remained open, but active leads had dried up. What no one could have known was that Victoria Hayes was alive and well, living under a different name in a different state. And she wasn't alone. 2 other women, identical to her in every physical detail, were also living their own carefully constructed lives, each carrying the same terrible secret. The truth about Victoria Hayes wouldn't emerge for another 47 years, but when it did, it would reveal a deception so elaborate, so audacious, that it would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about identity, memory, and the hidden operations of America's intelligence community during the Cold War. Chapter 2. The Shadow Search. The disappearance of Victoria Hayes followed a trajectory familiar to many cold cases. Intense initial investigation, gradual cooling of leads, periodic resurgences of interest, and long stretches of bureaucratic dormancy. Yet unlike many forgotten mysteries, Victoria's case would maintain a persistent presence in Vermont law enforcement, kept alive by a combination of the case's peculiarities, occasional new leads, and one woman's decades-long refusal to accept that her cousin had simply vanished. 1973-1979, the active years. For the first 7 years after Victoria's disappearance, the Vermont State Police maintained regular activity on the case. Every reported sighting was investigated, every tip-line call logged and followed up. The FBI maintained peripheral involvement, primarily checking if similar disappearances occurred elsewhere in New England. In March 1973, a librarian in Portland, Maine, contacted Vermont authorities. She had served a patron who bore a striking resemblance to Victoria Hayes. The woman had been researching maritime history and had asked detailed questions about immigration records from the 1950s. When shown Victoria's photograph, the librarian was 70% certain it was the same person. Investigators traveled to Portland, canvassing libraries, hotels, and bus stations. They found the woman, Rebecca Thompson, a graduate student at the University of Southern Maine, with a completely different appearance from Victoria. The resemblance had been superficial at best, another dead end in a case full of them. In November 1973, on the first anniversary of the disappearance, Margaret Hayes, Victoria's alleged cousin from Boston, contacted Vermont State Police. She wanted to know what progress had been made. When investigators questioned her about her own background and relationship to Victoria, Margaret became evasive and eventually stopped responding to requests for an interview. Attempts to locate Margaret for a formal interview failed. The Boston addresses she had provided to Victoria's neighbors didn't exist. The phone number she'd allegedly given Victoria was disconnected. Like Victoria herself, Margaret Hayes seemed to be a ghost. We began to suspect that Margaret Hayes was part of whatever Victoria was involved in, noted Detective Raymond Pierce, who took over the case in 1974. Two women, both using the Hayes surname, both with minimal documentation of their pasts, both connected to Burlington. It felt like a pattern, though we couldn't determine what kind. By 1975, investigators had developed three working theories. Theory 1, witness protection. Victoria had been a witness against organized crime and had been relocated under a false identity. Her disappearance was either her exiting the program or being discovered by those she'd testified against. Theory 2, intelligence operations. Victoria had been involved with intelligence work, possibly CIA or military intelligence. Her disappearance was a planned extraction when her cover was compromised. Theory 3, personal deception. Victoria had been living under a false identity to escape something in her past. An abusive relationship, criminal charges, family obligations. Her disappearance was a planned escape to yet another identity. Each theory had merit. Each also had significant gaps. The FBI denied any involvement with Victoria Hayes in witness protection programs. Intelligence agencies, as expected, neither confirmed nor denied any operations. And without knowing Victoria's true identity, investigating her past was impossible. The case's unusual elements continued to attract attention. In 1977, a freelance journalist from Boston published a long-form article about Victoria's disappearance in New England Monthly titled The Woman Who Never Was. The article explored the anomalies in Victoria's background and raised questions about government involvement. The article generated dozens of new tips, most speculative. One stood out. A retired State Department employee contacted investigators claiming to have knowledge of a classified program in the 1960s that involved creating false identities for intelligence assets. The program allegedly recruited young women and trained them to maintain cover identities for years at a time. The source refused to provide details without immunity from prosecution for revealing classified information. When investigators sought approval to offer such immunity, they were denied by federal authorities who claimed the source's information was either fictitious or so highly classified that investigation would compromise ongoing national security operations. "We hit a wall," Detective Pierce said. "The more we looked into the intelligence angle, the more resistance we encountered. Doors that should have opened for a missing person investigation remained locked." 1980s or 1989, the slow fade. The 1980s saw Victoria's case gradually recede from active investigation. New leadership in the Vermont State Police had different priorities: rising drug trafficking, property crimes, and managing the transition to computerized record systems. The Victoria Hayes file gathered dust in the cold case storage. However, Margaret Hayes, the mysterious cousin from Boston, refused to let the case die. Now living in Burlington and working as a social worker, Margaret had made finding Victoria her life's mission. Margaret's dedication was both impressive and puzzling to investigators. She saved every penny to hire private detectives. She organized annual memorial vigils that attracted media attention. She pestered law enforcement for updates. Her apartment became a command center filled with maps, timelines, and theories. Between 1982 and 1988, Margaret employed 4 different private investigators to re-examine the case. The most thorough was Samuel Cortez, a former Boston detective who spent 8 months in 1985 conducting his own investigation. Cortez's approach was methodical. He re-interviewed everyone who had known Victoria, visited every location connected to her life in Burlington, and attempted to trace her life before her arrival in Vermont. His most significant discovery came from Victoria's employment records. The Social Security number Victoria had used on her library employment application belonged to a Victoria Marie Hayes, who had died in infancy in Hartford, Connecticut in 1947. This practice, assuming the identity of deceased persons, was not uncommon among people creating false identities, but it confirmed what investigators had suspected. Victoria Hayes of Burlington was not who she claimed to be. Cortez also discovered something peculiar in Victoria's work patterns at the library. By interviewing staff and reviewing sign-in logs, he determined that Victoria had taken unusual absences approximately every 6 weeks. She would request a Friday off, citing personal matters, and would seem slightly different when she returned to work the following Monday. Different how? Cortez asked Martha Henderson, the former head librarian. librarian. Subtle things, Henderson explained. Maybe her hair would be parted on the opposite side, or she'd wear different jewelry, or she'd have a slight variation in her handwriting on library forms. I always attributed it to stress, or maybe she'd been sick. But now that you mention it, there was a pattern to these small changes. Cortez's final report to Margaret concluded that Victoria Hayes had likely been living under a false identity, possibly as part of an intelligence operation. The 6-week pattern of subtle changes suggested either that Victoria was periodically debriefed and retrained, or something even more unusual, that multiple women might have been sharing the Victoria Hayes identity. This latter theory seemed too far-fetched to take seriously in 1985. Cortez himself dismissed it in his report as an interesting but implausible hypothesis that warrants mention only for completeness. Despite these intriguing leads, Cortez ultimately concluded what others had before him. Without access to classified government records or a breakthrough in physical evidence, the case would remain unsolved. His report to Margaret was compassionate but final. Your cousin, whoever she truly was, covered her tracks exceptionally well. 1990–1999. New technologies, old mysteries. The 1990s brought revolutionary changes to criminal investigation, particularly in forensic science. DNA analysis transformed how law enforcement approached cold cases, providing tools that could extract answers from evidence that had sat dormant for decades. In 1994, Margaret Hayes petitioned for the physical evidence from Victoria's case to be re-examined using new DNA techniques. The Vermont State Police, now with a dedicated cold case unit, agreed. The physical evidence was limited. The Volkswagen had been sold years earlier, but investigators still had items collected from Victoria's apartment: hairbrushes, clothing, a toothbrush. These yielded usable DNA samples. Initial results in 1995 confirmed DNA profiles matching what would be expected from Victoria Hayes's biological material. But when technicians looked more closely, they found something anomalous: microscopic variations suggesting contamination or laboratory error. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the forensic scientist who conducted the analysis, noted in her report, "We're seeing what appears to be a single person's DNA, but with subtle markers that suggest either sample degradation, contamination during collection, or the presence of extremely closely related individuals' genetic material mixed together." This finding was flagged but not pursued further. DNA science was still relatively new, and ambiguous results were often attributed to technical issues rather than genuine biological mysteries. The most significant development of the 1990s came not from forensic science but from Margaret Hayes herself. In 1997, while organizing her extensive collection of materials about Victoria's case, Margaret discovered something that had been overlooked for 25 years: a series of photographs taken at library events between 1969 and 1972. When Margaret arranged these photos chronologically and examined them closely, she noticed something extraordinary. Victoria's appearance remained consistent in most ways, but subtle differences appeared in a pattern. In some photos, Victoria had a small mole on her left cheek. In others, the mole was absent. In some images, her earlobes were attached. In others, they were unattached. These weren't changes that could occur naturally. They represented different women. Margaret brought these photographs to the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit. Detective Judith Chen, who had recently taken over the case, was intrigued but skeptical. "Photos can be deceiving," Chen told Margaret. "Lighting, angles, photo quality, all of these can create illusions of difference. And even if we accept that these are different women, how do we explain dozens of colleagues who worked with Victoria every day and never noticed they were seeing different people?" Margaret had an answer. What if these women weren't just similar? What if they were identical triplets or even quadruplets, trained to substitute for each other so seamlessly that no one would notice? The theory was extraordinary, but it gained traction when Chen examined the photographs more carefully. The pattern of differences aligned precisely with Victoria's 6-week cycles of subtle change that Cortez had identified. Every 6 weeks or so, Victoria would take a Friday off, and when she returned, she'd be minutely different enough that sharp-eyed observers like Martha Henderson noticed something, but not so different that anyone questioned whether they were seeing the same person. "It's the perfect cover," Chen realized. One identity, multiple operatives. They could gather intelligence, attend debriefings, even operate in different locations simultaneously, and anyone investigating would only see one person. Despite this breakthrough in theory, Chen faced the same obstacles that had frustrated investigators for decades: no evidence, no access to classified records, and no way to identify who Victoria Hayes truly was or where she might be now. 2009, digital age, Old secrets. The early 2000s saw renewed interest in cold cases nationwide. Television shows, true crime podcasts, and internet forums brought public attention to forgotten mysteries. Victoria Hayes's disappearance became a favorite topic among amateur sleuths drawn to its unexplained elements. In 2003, a true crime blogger created a website dedicated to Victoria's case. The site compiled all known information, encouraged discussion, and maintained a timeline of events. Margaret Hayes became an active participant, sharing information and encouraging theories. The internet community developed its own investigation, crowdsourcing research into Cold War intelligence programs, tracking down former Vermont residents who had known Victoria, and analyzing the case from every conceivable angle. While most theories ranged from speculative to absurd, the community did make one significant contribution. They identified a pattern. Forum members discovered 3 other disappearances from the same era with similar characteristics: women in their 20s, living under apparently false identities, vanishing under mysterious circumstances that suggested staging rather than genuine disappearance. One in New Hampshire in 1970, one in Maine in 1974, and one in Massachusetts in 1976. All 4 women had worked in public-facing positions: librarian, teacher, social worker, nurse. All 4 had been described as friendly but private. All 4 had left behind minimal personal history. "It's not just Victoria," Margaret told Detective Chen in 2004. "It's a program. Multiple women, multiple locations, all part of the same operation. And somewhere, these women are still alive, living under new identities, carrying the same secrets." The pattern was compelling enough that Chen requested FBI involvement. By 2005, a joint task force was reviewing all 4 cases, looking for connections that might identify the program and its participants. The investigation stalled when federal authorities classified large portions of the file, citing national security concerns. Chen and her team were told that certain historical intelligence programs remain sensitive even decades after their conclusion, and disclosure could compromise ongoing operations. "They basically told us to stop looking," Chen said, which only confirmed that we were onto something real. By 2009, the case had reached another impasse. Margaret Hayes, now in her 50s, continued her solitary vigil, maintaining the website, organizing memorial events, and pestering anyone who might help. She had dedicated 37 years to finding her cousin, and she wasn't stopping now. What Margaret couldn't have known was that a breakthrough was just a decade away, waiting for DNA technology to advance one more crucial step, and for a new detective to ask the right questions in the right way. If you're as fascinated by this case as I am, make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter of this investigation is where everything changes. Hit that like button to help this story reach others who appreciate these incredible mysteries. The truth about Victoria Hayes was closer than anyone realized, hidden not in shadows but in plain sight across 3 different states. And when that truth finally emerged in 2019, it would prove that Margaret Hayes had been right all along. Victoria was alive, and she had never been alone. Barja. Chapter 3. The DNA Revelation. The year 2019 marked a watershed moment in forensic genealogy. The technique that had famously identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 had opened new frontiers in cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy combined traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research, using public DNA databases to identify suspects and victims through their family relationships. Detective Sarah Kovacs joined the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit in 2017, bringing with her expertise in genetic genealogy from previous work in California. When she reviewed Vermont's unsolved cases, Victoria Hayes's file immediately caught her attention. Everything about this case screamed identity deception, Kovacs recalled. The false social security number, the minimal paper trail, the suspicious disappearance. But what really intrigued me were those DNA results from 1995 showing anomalies. In 2019, we had tools that could analyze what those anomalies actually meant. With funding from a federal cold case grant, Kovacs secured approval to conduct comprehensive genetic genealogy on all physical evidence from the Victoria Hayes case. In February 2019, samples were sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia company specializing in advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy services. The initial results arrived in April 2019, and they were extraordinary. The DNA from Victoria Hayes's belongings didn't just show one profile. It showed multiple profiles so genetically similar that previous testing had interpreted them as a single contaminated sample. "We're looking at DNA from at least 3 individuals," Dr. Marcus Wellington, the lead geneticist at Parabon, explained to Kovacs in a video conference. These individuals are identical triplets. They originated from a single fertilized egg that split early in development. The genetic differences between them are minimal, the kind of random mutations that occur during cell division. The discovery confirmed Margaret Hayes's decades-old theory. Victoria Hayes had been multiple women, but who were they, and where were they now? The next phase involved genetic genealogy, uploading the DNA profiles to public databases like GEDmatch to search for relatives. This technique had solved numerous cold cases by identifying suspects through their cousins, uncles, or other family members who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA for genealogical research. The search hit pay dirt in May 2019. The Victoria Hayes DNA showed familial connections to several individuals whose genealogical trees could be traced back to a family in Philadelphia, the Mitchell family, specifically siblings born between 1940 and 1950. Covert assembled a team of genetic genealogists to build family trees and identify which Mitchell family members could be Victoria Hayes. The work was painstaking, requiring weeks of research through birth records, census data, marriage certificates, and death records. By July 2019, the team had narrowed the possibilities to three sisters, Evelyn Claire and Louise Mitchell, born on June 8, 1946, in Philadelphia. They were identical triplets, daughters of David Mitchell, a physicist who had worked on classified defense projects, and Helen Mitchell, a linguist who had worked for the State Department during World War II. Records showed the Mitchell family had moved to a rural area of Maryland in 1951, where David had taken a position at a government research facility. After that point, records for the three girls became sparse. They appeared in some census data and school records until 1960, then effectively vanished from public records. Children of people working in classified positions sometimes had unusual educational paths, noted Dr. Patricia Chen, a historian specializing in Cold War intelligence operations. There were classified boarding schools, specialized training programs, and yes, even recruitment into intelligence services while still minors. The Mitchell triplets disappearing from public records in their early teens suggests they entered some sort of classified program. Covert now faced a challenge. Finding three women who hadn't existed in public records for nearly 60 years. She needed to determine if they were still alive, and if so, what identities they were living under. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In August 2019, while researching the Mitchell family, Covert discovered that Helen Mitchell, the triplets' mother, had passed away in 2015. Her obituary, published in a Baltimore newspaper, mentioned surviving children: Evelyn Richards of Seattle, Washington, Claire Thompson of Denver, Colorado, and Louise Brennan of Portland, Oregon. Covert immediately ran background checks on these three women. Each was now 73 years old. Each had limited records before 1973, the year after Victoria Hayes disappeared. Each lived quiet, private lives with minimal digital footprints. Most significantly, when Covert obtained driver's license photos of the three women, they were clearly identical, even aged into their 70s. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. These were the same three faces, weathered by time but structurally identical. "We'd found them," Covert said. "After 47 years, we'd found Victoria Hayes, or rather we'd found the three women who had shared that identity." The next question was whether these women had committed any crimes. Disappearing under a false identity wasn't necessarily illegal, especially if it had been done as part of government service. The staged disappearance in 1972 might have been an authorized extraction from a covert operation. Covert contacted the FBI and the CIA, requesting information about any classified programs that might have involved the Mitchell triplets. The response was familiar to anyone who had investigated this case: neither confirmation nor denial, and strong suggestions that further inquiry might compromise national security. "We were being told to back off," Covert recalled, "but I had a responsibility to at least speak with these women, to determine if they were victims, perpetrators, or some combination of both." In September 2019, Covert made a decision that would bring the case to its conclusion. Rather than attempting covert surveillance or confrontational interviews, she opted for direct, simultaneous contact. She drafted a carefully worded letter explaining that new DNA evidence had connected them to the 1972 disappearance of Victoria Hayes from Burlington, Vermont, and invited them to contact her to discuss the matter confidentially. The letters were sent by certified mail to all three addresses on September 15, 2019. Covert expected either silence or immediate consultation with attorneys. What happened instead was remarkable. On September 16, all three women disappeared from their homes. Neighbors in Seattle reported Evelyn Richards leaving with a small suitcase around noon. Witnesses in Denver saw Claire Thompson depart her apartment early in the afternoon. Portland police, alerted by concerned neighbors, found Louise Brennan's home empty by evening. "They vanished just like Victoria had in 1972, Covert noted. Clean, efficient, leaving no mess behind. It was confirmation that these women had indeed been the ones living as Victoria Hayes, and that their training had never left them. But this time, modern technology captured what 1972's investigative tools could not. Traffic cameras recorded Evelyn driving east from Seattle. ATM footage showed Claire withdrawing cash in Idaho. Cell phone tower data placed Louise heading south from Portland. Most significantly, additional traffic cameras and license plate readers tracked all three women converging on a remote area in eastern Oregon, near the abandoned site of what had once been a government research facility, decommissioned in the 1970s. They were meeting up, Kovacs realized, probably for the first time in decades. They knew we'd found them, and they were coordinating their response. On September 19th, as Kovacs prepared to request federal assistance in locating the three women, her phone rang. The caller identified himself as an attorney from Washington, D.C., representing three clients who wished to negotiate the terms of their surrender and cooperation with Vermont authorities. The mystery of Victoria Hayes was about to be solved, but the full truth would prove even more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. Frunzau. Chapter 4. The Truth Emerges. On September 25, 2019, in a secure conference room at the FBI field office in Boston, Detective Sarah Kovacs came face-to-face with the answer to a mystery that had haunted Vermont for 47 years. Seated across from her were three identical elderly women, their silver hair styled similarly, their green eyes sharp and alert despite their age, their postures identical down to the angle at which they held their heads. Evelyn Richards, Claire Thompson, and Louise Brennan, or rather Evelyn Claire and Louise Mitchell, had agreed to full disclosure in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Their attorney, Marcus Webb, a former Justice Department official with top-level security clearances, had negotiated terms that would allow them to tell their story while protecting them from potential charges ranging from identity fraud to espionage-related offenses. "We've been waiting for this conversation for 47 years, Evelyn began, her voice still carrying traces of the warmth that library patrons had once found so comforting. In some ways, it's a profound relief to finally tell the truth. What unfolded over the next 8 hours was a story so extraordinary that Kovacs had arranged for the entire session to be recorded with appropriate security protocols in place. The tale the Mitchell sisters told reached back to the height of Cold War paranoia and revealed a classified program that had turned children into living deceptions. The early years, recruitment, and training. The Mitchell triplets were born on June 8, 1946, to parents already deeply embedded in classified government work. Their father, David Mitchell, was a physicist working on nuclear weapons development. Their mother, Helen Mitchell, had been a military intelligence analyst and cryptographer during World War II. "We were barely 5 years old when the recruiters came," Claire explained. "Men in suits visiting our home, having long conversations with our parents in hushed tones. Even at that age, we understood something significant was happening." The program was called Project Trinity, a classified initiative run by a joint Department of Defense and CIA task force. The concept was revolutionary: train identical siblings from early childhood to function as a single person, creating intelligence assets who could be in multiple places simultaneously or maintain deep cover for extended periods without the usual operational vulnerabilities. The Cold War was at its height, Evelyn continued. The government was experimenting with every conceivable method of gaining advantage over the Soviets. We weren't the only sets of multiples recruited. There were at least a dozen other sets of twins and triplets in the program, maybe more. In 1951, the Mitchell family relocated to a classified facility in rural Maryland. Officially, David Mitchell was conducting physics research. In reality, the family had been absorbed into Project Trinity, and the three girls began their training. "They called it specialized education," Louise said, her voice carrying a hint of bitterness. "But it was systematic indoctrination. We were taught to think, move, speak, and respond identically. Every gesture had to be replicated perfectly. Every speech pattern had to match. We spent hours watching films of ourselves, identifying and correcting the slightest variations. The training was comprehensive and intense. The sisters learned multiple languages, studied mathematics and sciences, received physical conditioning, and practiced advanced memorization techniques. Most crucially, they learned to share a single identity seamlessly, maintaining detailed logs of every experience so that any one of them could convincingly claim to have lived that experience. "We kept synchronized journals," Claire explained. "If Evelyn went to a movie on Tuesday, Louise and I would read her detailed account. We'd study what she wore, what she ate, who she spoke to, how she felt about the film. By the time we finished reading, her experience became our experience. We could all claim to have seen that movie." By age 12, The triplets were fluent in Russian and German. By 15, they had mastered the art of seamless identity substitution. At 18, they received their first field assignment, a test deployment to see if 3 people could truly function as one without detection. They enrolled us at a small college in Massachusetts, Evelyn recalled. We alternated attending classes as Barbara Wilson, a psychology major. Each of us would take different classes on different days, then brief the others on everything that happened. The professors never knew they were teaching 3 different students. The experiment was a complete success. Over 4 semesters, the Mitchell triplets maintained the Barbara Wilson identity without a single professor, classmate, or administrator detecting the substitution. Project Trinity had proven its concept. Properly trained identical siblings could create and maintain a shared false identity indefinitely. The Victoria Hayes Operation. After several more training deployments and operational assignments along the East Coast, the Mitchell sisters received their most significant mission in early 1969. They would create and maintain a new identity, Victoria Hayes, in Burlington, Vermont. Burlington was strategically important despite its small size, Louise explained. The university had research programs relevant to defense. The proximity to Canadian border made it a potential route for Soviet intelligence operations, and several defense contractors had operations in the region. We were to establish Victoria Hayes as a trusted community member who could observe and report on activities of interest. The operation began with the creation of Victoria's background. Using the identity of a deceased infant, the program manufactured a complete paper trail, birth certificate, educational records, employment history, even a library science degree from Simmons College that was genuine. The triplets had actually attended classes there in rotation, just as they'd done in their test deployment. We were Victoria Hayes collectively, Claire said. Evelyn would work at the library for 2 weeks, gathering information and maintaining the cover identity. Then Louise would take over for 2 weeks while Evelyn debriefed and rested. Then I'd rotate in for 2 weeks. We'd exchange detailed reports on every interaction, every conversation, every detail of Victoria's life. The rotation system meant each sister spent about 4 months per year as Victoria Hayes in Burlington, while the other 8 months were devoted to debriefing, training, and other intelligence assignments. The 6-week cycles that private investigator Samuel Cortez had identified in the 1980s were the handoff periods when one sister would leave Burlington and another would arrive. We were careful, but not perfect, Evelyn admitted. Small things would change during handoffs, a slightly different hairstyle, jewelry choices, minor variations in handwriting. But people expect small changes. They attribute them to mood, health, personal choice. No one suspects they're seeing different people. The operation proceeded smoothly for over 3 years. The Mitchell sisters, as Victoria Hayes, became an established and beloved member of the Burlington community. They gathered intelligence on university research programs, observed individuals of interest, and reported on any suspicious activities that might indicate foreign intelligence operations. The irony was that we came to love being Victoria, Louise said softly. She was the only normal life we'd ever known. Working at the library, having colleagues who genuinely liked us, being part of a community. It was everything our real lives as intelligence assets never allowed. But the sisters' careful deception began to unravel in the summer of 1972. The unraveling. In August 1972, Louise was serving her rotation as Victoria Hayes when she attended a university lecture on Cold War politics. Among the attendees was Professor James Whitman, a visiting scholar from MIT who was giving a series of talks across New England. I didn't think anything of it at the time, Louise explained. I introduced myself as Victoria Hayes. We had a brief conversation about library resources, and that was it. But 2 weeks later, when Evelyn was Victoria, she attended another lecture in the series. Professor Whitman recognized her, or thought he recognized her, and referenced their previous conversation. Evelyn, having no knowledge of Louise's interaction with Whitman, responded with confusion. She had no memory of their supposed previous meeting. To Whitman, a trained academic with an eye for detail, Victoria's complete lack of memory about a conversation from 2 weeks earlier was suspicious. He started watching Victoria more carefully, Claire continued the story. And because we were in a handoff period, he observed both Louise and me within a short time frame. He was brilliant enough to recognize what he was seeing, not one woman with a bad memory, but multiple identical women. Professor Whitman had something else that made him particularly dangerous to the operation. He had previously worked as a consultant for defense intelligence projects. He understood classified programs. He knew what he was observing had national security implications. He contacted his former handlers in Washington, Evelyn said, not to expose us, but to report what he'd discovered and request guidance. But his inquiry triggered alarms. Our program handlers learned that our cover was compromised. On September 2nd, 1972, the Mitchell sisters received emergency contact from their handler, a man they knew only as Mr. Gray. They were told to execute their extraction protocol immediately. The Victoria Hayes identity had been compromised and needed to be terminated in a way that wouldn't expose Project Trinity. "We had exactly 24 hours, Louise recalled, her voice tight with emotion. 24 hours to erase Victoria Hayes from existence and disappear into new identities. It was what we'd been trained for, but actually doing it felt like killing a part of ourselves." The staged disappearance at Lake Champlain was executed according to their contingency training. The running car, the abandoned purse, the cryptic note, all designed to suggest suicide without providing a body that could definitively prove death. The ambiguity would keep investigators looking in the wrong direction, searching for a body that didn't exist, rather than recognizing that Victoria Hayes had never been a single person. The note, "I'm sorry, I can't keep living this lie," was literally true, Claire said. Victoria couldn't keep living the lie because Victoria wasn't real. We were ending the deception. That night, the three sisters met at a safe house in upstate New York. It was the first time they'd been together in the same room since the operation began. They spent a few precious hours together, sharing their experiences, grieving the loss of Victoria Hayes, and preparing for their final separation. "They told us we could never contact each other again," Evelyn said, tears now visible in her eyes. Project Trinity was being phased out. The intelligence community had decided that programs like ours were too risky, too difficult to maintain, too ethically problematic. We were relics of an approach that was no longer favored. Each sister was given a new identity with a complete backstory. Evelyn became Evelyn Richards, a young widow relocating to Seattle. Claire became Claire Thompson, a graduate student at the University of Denver. Louise became Louise Brennan, taking a position as a research librarian in Portland, Oregon. "We were told to build real lives under these names," Louise explained, "to never reveal our true identities, never contact each other, and never acknowledge our past service. We were promised that if we maintained operational security, we'd be protected, but if we exposed the program, we'd face prosecution." For 47 years, the Mitchell sisters had honored that agreement, living separate lives under their assigned identities. Each had built a career, developed friendships, and created the semblance of a normal life. None had married or had children, a decision each made independently to protect the secrets they carried. The mysterious Margaret. Throughout the interview, Detective Kovacs had been taking detailed notes, stopping occasionally to ask clarifying questions. But there was one mystery that still needed resolution. "What about Margaret Hayes?" Kovacs asked. "Victoria's supposed cousin from Boston who visited Burlington and who spent decades searching for her. Where does she fit into this?" The three sisters exchanged glances, a wordless communication that decades of separation hadn't erased. "Margaret Hayes was our handler's most brilliant innovation," Evelyn said finally, "and his cruelest." What the sisters revealed next added yet another layer to the already extraordinary deception. Margaret Hayes was also part of Project Trinity, but in a different capacity. She was what the program called a tether, a person given false memories of a relationship with the cover identity to make that identity seem more real and to assist in the deception if needed. Margaret's real name was Sarah Donnelly, Claire explained. She was recruited into the program as a child from an orphanage. She was subjected to experimental memory implantation techniques that were years ahead of their time. Through a combination of hypnosis, suggestion, and manufactured evidence like fake family photographs, she was given a complete set of false memories of growing up as Victoria Hayes' cousin. The program had created Margaret's false memories to serve multiple purposes. First, her occasional visits to Burlington made Victoria seem more connected and real. Second, if Victoria ever needed assistance maintaining her cover, Margaret could provide corroboration of her background. Third, Margaret served as an insurance policy, someone who would keep the case alive if Victoria had to disappear, ensuring investigators focused on finding a missing person rather than questioning whether Victoria Hayes had been real. Margaret believed completely that she was Victoria's cousin, Louise said, her voice heavy with guilt. Her memories of family vacations and childhood birthdays were all manufactured, but to her, they were absolutely real. When Victoria disappeared, her grief was genuine because she genuinely believed she'd lost family. After the 1972 extraction, Margaret had been allowed to maintain her false memories. The program handlers believed her continued search for Victoria would reinforce the cover story and distract from the truth. Margaret had unknowingly served the program for 47 years, her entire adult life devoted to searching for someone who had never existed. "We've lived with the guilt of that for decades," Evelyn said quietly. "Margaret suffered because of us, because of a program that used children as experimental subjects, and treated human identity as just another tool of espionage. Kovach absorbed this information in silence for a moment. The implications were staggering, not just for the Mitchell sisters' case, but for understanding how far intelligence agencies had gone during the Cold War. Margaret is still in Burlington, Kovach said finally. She's still maintaining that website about Victoria's disappearance. She still organizes memorial vigils. Her entire adult life has been built around searching for you. We know, Louise said softly, and that's why we're willing to tell the full truth now, despite the risks. Margaret deserves to know. She deserves to reclaim her real identity, whatever that might mean after a lifetime of false memories. The aftermath. After 8 hours of testimony, the Mitchell sisters had provided a comprehensive account of Project Trinity, their roles in it, and the Victoria Hayes operation. They had corroborated their story with details that could be verified, suggested sources for documentation that might still exist in classified archives, and expressed willingness to assist in identifying other victims of similar programs. We're old women now, Claire said as the interview concluded. Whatever consequences come from this disclosure, we're prepared to face them. But more importantly, we want to help others like Margaret, people who were used by the program and deserve to know the truth. Detective Kovach left the interview with a complex mixture of emotions. She had solved the case, but the solution opened more questions than it answered. How many other operations like Victoria Hayes had existed? How many other people had been given false memories? What responsibility did the government bear for these programs? Over the following weeks, Kovach worked with federal authorities to verify the Mitchell sisters' account. Heavily redacted documents confirmed that Project Trinity had existed. Former intelligence officials, granted immunity to testify, corroborated details about the program's operations. The case was real, the deception had been real, and the implications were profound. The most immediate concern was Margaret Hayes, or rather, Sarah Donnelly. Someone would need to tell her the truth to explain that her entire understanding of her identity and purpose was based on manufactured memories. Kovach knew this conversation would be one of the most difficult of her career. Hit that like button if you're as shocked by this revelation as I was. The truth is stranger than any fiction anyone could write, and we're not done yet. The story of what happened when Margaret learned the truth is coming up next. Chapter 5. Confronting the Past. On October 3, 2019, Detective Sarah Kovach sat in the living room of a small house on Pine Street in Burlington, Vermont. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and printed web pages. 47 years of documentation about the disappearance of Victoria Hayes. In the center of it all sat Margaret Hayes, now 66 years old, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes bright with the hope that always accompanied news about Victoria's case. Kovach had requested this meeting without explaining its purpose. Margaret assumed it was another routine update, perhaps a new tip to investigate or an anniversary commemoration to plan. She had no idea that her entire world was about to shatter. "I've found Victoria," Kovach said gently, knowing there was no easy way to begin. Or rather, "I've found the truth about Victoria Hayes." Margaret leaned forward, hope and fear mingling in her expression. "Is she alive? Where has she been?" "Margaret," Kovach continued, her voice steady but compassionate. "Victoria Hayes never existed as a single person. She was a cover identity created and maintained by 3 women, identical triplets named Evelyn, Claire, and Louise Mitchell. They were intelligence operatives working for a classified Cold War program." The color drained from Margaret's face. For several long moments, she sat perfectly still, as if processing information in a language she didn't quite understand. That's not possible," she whispered finally. "I know Victoria. I remember growing up with her. Family dinners, birthdays, summers at the lake house. I remember everything." Kovach reached into her briefcase and removed a folder. "Margaret, I need to tell you something even more difficult. Your name isn't Margaret Hayes. You were born Sarah Donnelly. You were recruited as a child into the same program that created Victoria Hayes. The memories you have of growing up with Victoria were artificially implanted through experimental psychological techniques." Margaret's hands began to tremble. She looked around the room at the evidence of her life's work, the photographs, the timelines, the maps of Burlington marked with locations significant to Victoria's disappearance. Decades of searching, all based on a foundation of manufactured memory. "No," Margaret said, her voice rising. I remember my parents, Helen and Robert Hayes. I remember our house in Connecticut. I remember Victoria teaching me to ride a bike. Those are my memories. They're real. Kovacs opened the folder and spread out several documents. "These are photographs from the Project Trinity facility where the program operated. This is you as a child, being raised alongside the Mitchell triplets. Your birth name appears in orphanage records from Philadelphia. There are no Helen and Robert Hayes. There was no house in Connecticut. Those memories were created." Margaret picked up one of the black and white photographs with shaking hands. It showed a young girl, unmistakably a younger version of herself, standing in what appeared to be an institutional setting. Other children were visible in the background. The image had none of the warmth of family photographs. It looked like a government facility. "This isn't real," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "This can't be real." For the next hour, Kovacs carefully walked Margaret through the evidence, the Mitchell sisters' testimony, the classified documents confirming Project Trinity's existence, the historical records showing how the program had created false memories in its subjects. Margaret listened in silence, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, anger, and finally, a terrible dawning comprehension. Tears streamed down her face as the foundations of her identity crumbled. 47 years, Margaret whispered. "I've spent 47 years of my life searching for someone who never existed. I built my entire identity around being Victoria's cousin, around finding her, around keeping her memory alive. Who am I if all of that is a lie?" "You're the woman who never gave up," Kovacs said gently. "Regardless of the truth about Victoria, your dedication, your persistence, your loyalty, those are real. Your emotions are real. The impact you've had on this community, keeping this case alive, is real." Margaret stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Burlington street she'd lived on for most of her adult life. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a lifetime's deception. "I want to meet them," Margaret said finally, turning back to Kovacs. "The Mitchell sisters. I need to look them in the eyes and hear them explain why they let me spend my life chasing a ghost." Kovacs had anticipated this request. "They've agreed to meet with you. They've expressed, remorse isn't a strong enough word. They carry tremendous guilt about what happened to you." "As they should," Margaret said, anger flashing in her eyes. "They watched me search year after year. They knew I was living a lie and they said nothing. They were following orders," Kovacs offered, knowing the explanation was inadequate. "And they were afraid that contact would put everyone at risk, including you." Margaret turned back to the window. "I need time," she said quietly. "Time to process this. Time to figure out who Sarah Donnelly is, or was, or should be. I've been Margaret Hayes my entire life. I don't know how to be anyone else." Over the following days, Kovacs arranged for Margaret to receive counseling from a psychologist specializing in trauma and identity issues. Dr. Patricia Winters, who had worked with victims of cult indoctrination and other forms of psychological manipulation, helped Margaret begin the difficult process of reconciling her false memories with her true history. "False memories are neurologically indistinguishable from real ones," Dr. Winters explained. "The emotions attached to them are genuine, even if the events didn't happen." Margaret's grief over losing Victoria is real grief, even though Victoria wasn't real. She's mourning not just the loss of a person, but the loss of her own identity. 2 weeks after learning the truth, Margaret agreed to meet with the Mitchell sisters. The meeting was held at a private location, with only Kovacs and Dr. Winters present to facilitate. When Margaret entered the room and saw 3 identical elderly women, the reality of the situation hit her with fresh force. These were the faces she remembered as Victoria, slightly aged, but unmistakably the same bone structure, the same eyes, the same subtle mannerisms. "We owe you an apology that no words can adequately express," Evelyn said, speaking for all 3 sisters. "We were children when we were recruited into this program, but we were adults during the Victoria Hayes operation. We knew what was being done to you, and we said nothing." "You didn't just say nothing," Margaret replied, her voice controlled but cold. "You watched me suffer. You watched me dedicate my life to searching for you. Every year on the anniversary, I'd hold a vigil, and you knew Victoria was safe because Victoria had never been in danger. How could you stay silent?" "We were scared," Louise admitted. "Scared of breaking our oaths, scared of the consequences, scared that revealing the truth would put everyone at risk. But those are explanations, not excuses. What was done to you was unconscionable, and we were part of it." The meeting lasted 3 hours. The Mitchell sisters provided details about Margaret's recruitment into the program, explained how her false memories had been created, and answered every painful question she asked. They offered no justifications, only honest acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. By the end, Margaret's anger had transformed into something more complex, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. You were victims too, Margaret said finally. Children recruited into something you couldn't consent to, trained to deceive as a patriotic duty, then abandoned when the program ended. We're all victims of Project Trinity. This recognition marked a turning point. Over the following months, Margaret and the Mitchell sisters began meeting regularly, not as perpetrators and victim, but as survivors of the same program trying to make sense of their shared history. Going public. In December 2019, after consultation with the Mitchell sisters and Margaret, Detective Kovacs held a press conference to announce the resolution of the Victoria Hayes case. The announcement was carefully worded to protect classified information while revealing the essential truth. Victoria Hayes had been a cover identity used by intelligence operatives, and her disappearance had been a planned extraction from a compromised operation. The public reaction was explosive. National media descended on Burlington. Cable news shows devoted hours to discussing the case. Social media exploded with theories, debates, and shocked reactions. The revelation sparked intense public interest in Cold War-era intelligence programs. Investigative journalists began researching other cases that might have similar explanations. Congress announced hearings into historical intelligence operations that had used children as subjects. For Burlington residents, particularly those who had known Victoria, the revelation was disorienting. Former library colleagues struggled to reconcile their memories of their friend with the knowledge that she had been 3 different women. Former patrons questioned their own recollections. Some felt betrayed, others were fascinated. "It makes me question everything I remember about that time," said Martha Henderson, the former head librarian, in an interview with Vermont Public Radio. "Were the conversations I had with Victoria real? Did she actually care about the library and the community? Or was it all performance? I suppose we'll never really know." The Mitchell sisters, through their attorney, released a statement expressing remorse for the deception and acknowledging the harm caused to the Burlington community. They declined most interview requests, seeking to live quietly after decades of secrecy. Margaret's story attracted particular attention. Her transformation from devoted searcher to victim of psychological manipulation resonated with people worldwide. She received thousands of messages of support and was invited to speak at conferences about memory, identity, and government accountability. In March 2020, Margaret made a difficult decision. She legally changed her name to Sarah Donnelly Hayes, reclaiming her birth name while honoring the identity she'd known for most of her life. "I can't erase Margaret Hayes," she explained in a rare interview. "Those memories, false as they were, shaped who I became. But I also want to acknowledge Sarah Donnelly, the child who was taken from an orphanage and used in a government experiment. I'm both of them now, trying to build a future from the pieces of 2 pasts. Legal and political aftermath." The exposure of Project Trinity created significant legal and political repercussions. The Department of Justice established a special task force to investigate Cold War-era programs that had used children as subjects without proper consent or oversight. In May 2020, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence held closed hearings on Project Trinity. The Mitchell sisters and Margaret testified for 4 days, providing detailed accounts of the program's operations. Though most of the proceedings remained classified, the committee released a summary report acknowledging that certain experimental intelligence programs during the Cold War period violated basic ethical standards and caused lasting harm to their subjects. The report confirmed that Project Trinity had operated from 1951 to 1974, recruiting at least 20 sets of identical twins or triplets, along with approximately 50 tether subjects like Margaret. The program had created multiple shared identities deployed across the United States and occasionally overseas, gathering intelligence through long-term infiltration of communities. The committee recommended establishment of a compensation fund for verified victims of the program, declassification of Project Trinity documents to allow historical research, strengthened oversight mechanisms to prevent similar programs, creation of a confidential process for other potential victims to come forward. Following the report's release, 3 more individuals came forward claiming to have been part of similar programs. Each case was investigated, and 2 were verified as legitimate Project Trinity victims. The Mitchell sisters were not prosecuted for their roles in the Victoria Hayes operation. Federal prosecutors determined that they had been recruited as children, operated under orders while the program was active, and had maintained silence after its termination based on legitimate concerns about national security and personal safety. The program's handlers and administrators proved more difficult to hold accountable. Most were elderly or deceased. Those still living claimed they had been following orders and operating within the legal frameworks of their time. However problematic those frameworks networks now appeared. Only one significant arrest occurred. Walter Morrison, who had served as Mr. Gray, the Mitchell sisters' primary handler. Now 84 years old, Morrison was charged with obstruction of justice and making false statements to investigators. After pleading guilty to reduced charges, he was sentenced to 3 years of house arrest given his age and health conditions. The broader pattern. As news of Project Trinity spread, researchers began identifying patterns in other unsolved disappearances from the Cold War era. At least 8 cases across New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Pacific Northwest showed characteristics consistent with Project Trinity operations. Young women living under apparently false identities, minimal paper trails, and staged disappearances that left no bodies. Working with federal authorities, investigators from multiple states formed a task force to review these cases using modern DNA analysis and genealogical research. By late 2020, 3 additional Project Trinity operations had been conclusively identified. Linda Brennan, who disappeared from Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1968, was confirmed to have been identical triplets operating under a shared identity. Carol Washington, who vanished from Portland, Maine in 1971, was revealed to have been identical twins. Susan Martinez, who disappeared from Providence, Rhode Island in 1975, was proven to have been identical quadruplets. Each revelation brought its own painful truths and reunited operatives who had been separated for decades. Each case had its own tether victim, someone given false memories who had spent years searching for people who had never existed. The discoveries transformed understanding of Cold War intelligence operations and sparked ongoing debates about the ethics of using children in covert programs, the limits of national security justifications, and the government's responsibility to victims of historical abuses. Healing and reconciliation. For the Mitchell sisters and Margaret, the path forward required rebuilding lives on foundations of truth rather than deception. The sisters, after 47 years apart, chose to live together in a small coastal town in Maine. They spent their days gardening, reading, and slowly rebuilding the sisterhood that Project Trinity had fractured. They declined most media requests, but occasionally consulted with investigators on cold cases potentially involving similar operations. "We lost so many years," Claire said in one of their rare interviews. "We can't get that time back, but we can make the most of whatever time we have left. Being together, being ourselves without deception, it's a gift we never thought we'd have." Margaret established the Project Trinity Accountability Foundation, a non-profit organization supporting victims of government experimentation and advocating for transparency in historical intelligence operations. She worked to identify other potential victims and helped them navigate the complex process of reclaiming their identities. Her relationship with the Mitchell sisters evolved from confrontation to understanding to something approaching friendship. They would never be family. The false memories of cousinhood had been too painful to sustain, but they were bound together by their shared experience as victims of the same program. "I've stopped trying to untangle what's real from what was implanted," Margaret said in a 2021 interview. "My memories of Victoria may be false, but the emotions they generated were real. The person I became while searching for her is real. I'm building forward from here rather than trying to excavate some pure truth from my past." Dr. Patricia Winters, who continued working with Project Trinity victims, noted that this approach represented healthy adaptation. "Identity is constructed from our experiences and memories," she explained. "When those memories are revealed to be false, it doesn't erase the person you've become. It just means you have to rebuild your narrative with new understanding." For Vermont, and particularly Burlington, the resolution of the Victoria Hayes case brought closure to a 47-year mystery, while opening conversations about trust, memory, and community. Fletcher Free Library established a memorial plaque acknowledging all those whose lives were touched by the Victoria Hayes case, without attempting to explain the complex truth behind it. The cherry-red Volkswagen Beetle, which had been sold at auction decades earlier and passed through multiple owners, was tracked down and acquired by the Vermont Historical Society. It was restored and displayed as part of an exhibit on Cold War-era intelligence operations, a tangible reminder of the operation that had deceived an entire community. What this case taught us. The Victoria Hayes case, or more accurately, the Project Trinity revelations, transformed multiple fields of study and practice. Cold case investigation. The case demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy combined with traditional detective work. Detective Sarah Kovach's refusal to accept that some mysteries are unsolvable led to techniques now used routinely in cold case investigations nationwide. Forensic psychology. The successful implantation of false memories in Margaret and other tether subjects advanced understanding of memory formation and manipulation. This research has implications for understanding eyewitness testimony, recovered memory therapy, and how propaganda can shape belief systems. Intelligence ethics. The exposure of Project Trinity contributed to ongoing debates about the ethical limits of intelligence operations. Congressional oversight of intelligence agencies was strengthened, and new protocols were established to prevent the use of minors in covert operations. Identity studies. The case raised profound philosophical questions about the nature of identity. If three people can convincingly be one person, what does that say about the stability of identity? If our memories can be manufactured, how do we know who we really are? This case challenges our most fundamental assumptions, noted Dr. James Foster, a philosopher specializing in questions of identity and consciousness. It suggests that identity is more performative and constructed than we typically acknowledge. The Mitchell sisters weren't pretending to be Victoria Hayes. They were Victoria Hayes, at least in any meaningful social sense. Current status. As of 2024, the Mitchell sisters continue living together in Maine. Evelyn, Claire, and Louise are now 78 years old, enjoying a retirement characterized by the simple pleasure of being able to be themselves without deception. Margaret, or Sarah, continues her advocacy work through the Project Trinity Accountability Foundation. Now 71, she has helped identify 7 additional victims of similar programs and assisted them in reclaiming their identities and accessing compensation. The Federal Compensation Fund, established for Project Trinity victims, has paid out over $40 million to 73 verified victims or their families. The program accepts new claims and continues investigating potential cases. Declassified documents from Project Trinity are now available to researchers at the National Archives, providing a comprehensive look at how the program operated. These documents have spawned dozens of academic studies, several books, and multiple documentary films. Detective Sarah Kovacs received the National Cold Case Medal of Honor for her work on the case. She now leads a federal task force specializing in cold cases with potential intelligence operation connections, applying lessons learned from the Victoria Hayes investigation to other mysteries. Burlington remembers Victoria Hayes not as a ghost or a lie, but as a complex truth about a particular moment in history. Annual memorial services are still held, but they've evolved into gatherings that honor all victims of Project Trinity, while educating newer generations about this dark chapter of intelligence history. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, cases that challenge everything you thought you knew. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And let me know in the comments, what other cold cases do you think might have explanations we haven't even imagined yet? Epilogue. Questions without answers. 5 years after the truth emerged from the fog of 1972, questions remain. Project Trinity's full scope may never be known. How many other operations existed? How many other victims are still living under false identities, unaware of their true histories? How many mysteries remain unsolved because investigators never considered that one person might actually be multiple people? The case of Victoria Hayes, of Evelyn, Claire, and Louise Mitchell, and of Sarah Donnelly stands as a reminder that truth is often stranger than the most elaborate fiction. It reveals how far governments went during the Cold War, how malleable human identity can be, and how secrets buried for decades can finally surface when technology and determination intersect. Perhaps the most profound legacy of this case is the reminder that behind every unsolved mystery lies the potential for extraordinary complexity. Behind every disappearance, every unexplained vanishing, every case that defies conventional explanation, there might be truths that challenge our basic assumptions about how the world works. Detective Sarah Kovacs, reflecting on the case in a 2023 interview, put it this way: "We're trained to think in terms of individual perpetrators and individual victims. We're taught to look for the simplest explanation. But sometimes the truth isn't simple. Sometimes it's so complex, so unprecedented, that it hides in plain sight because we lack the conceptual framework to even consider it as a possibility." The Mitchell sisters have their own perspective on their extraordinary lives. In a rare joint interview conducted in 2022, they reflected on what it meant to have lived as 3 fragments of a fictional whole. "People ask if we feel like we lost our identities," Evelyn said, "but we never really had individual identities to lose. We were raised from early childhood to be one person together." In some ways, Victoria Hayes was the most real identity any of us ever had, because for the first time we were allowed to be part of a community, to have genuine relationships, to experience something approaching normal life, even if it was all based on a lie, Claire added. Even if every interaction was technically a deception, the emotions were real, the friendships were real, the satisfaction of helping a child find the perfect book, or assisting a student with research. Those moments mattered, regardless of which one of us was Victoria that day. "What we lost wasn't our identities," Louise concluded. "What we lost was the opportunity to be sisters, to know each other as individuals rather than components of a single constructed persona. We're reclaiming that now, at the end of our lives. Better late than never. Margaret, or Sarah, or the hybrid identity she has created from both names, has found her own peace with the impossible complexity of her history. I spent decades searching for someone who didn't exist, she said in her 2023 memoir, False Memory, A Life Built on Lies. But that search wasn't wasted. It made me who I am. It gave me purpose, taught me persistence, connected me to a community. The foundation was false, but the structure built on it was real. I'm not erasing Margaret Hayes to become Sarah Donnelly. I'm integrating both into someone new. Her memoir became a bestseller, resonating with readers who recognized in her story something universal about the nature of identity and memory. We're all, in some sense, constructed from stories we tell ourselves about who we are. We all have memories that may not be entirely accurate. We all build identities on foundations that might be more fragile than we like to admit. The difference for Margaret was that her story was deliberately engineered by others, but her response, to acknowledge the deception while honoring the person she became because of it, offers a model for resilience in the face of identity crisis. The unanswered questions. Despite the comprehensive resolution of the Victoria Hayes case, mysteries remain. The full extent of Project Trinity may never be known. The program's archives, while partially declassified, still contain redacted sections that may never be fully revealed. How many other operations existed beyond those that have been identified? The Mitchell sisters estimate there were at least 20 sets of identical siblings in the program, but they only knew about their own operation and fragments of information about others. If their estimate is accurate, more than a dozen Project Trinity operations remain unidentified. What happened to the children recruited into the program who didn't complete training? Records suggest not all recruits were successfully transformed into effective operatives. Some children couldn't master the necessary skills. Others had psychological breaks from the intense pressure of living as someone else. What became of these failed recruits? Were they returned to normal lives, or were they silenced to protect the program's security? Were similar programs operated by other intelligence agencies? Project Trinity was a joint Department of Defense and CIA initiative. But were there parallel programs run by military intelligence, the FBI, or other agencies? Did America's Cold War adversaries develop similar operations? These questions may never be fully answered. The intelligence community has shown limited willingness to disclose additional information, citing both national security concerns and the desire to protect any remaining victims who may still be living under false identities, unaware of their true histories. The living legacy. Today, the story of Victoria Hayes lives on in multiple forms. The case has been the subject of 3 documentary films, including 3 Women, One Identity, which won critical acclaim at the Sundance Film Festival. Podcasts have devoted dozens of episodes to analyzing every aspect of the case. Academics across multiple disciplines, history, psychology, philosophy, intelligence studies, continue to research and debate the implications. Fletcher Free Library in Burlington now houses a small permanent exhibit about the case. It includes photographs of Victoria Hayes, all 3 versions of her, artifacts from the investigation, and information about Project Trinity. The exhibit's centerpiece is one of Victoria's library cards, mounted under glass, a mundane object that represents an extraordinary deception. The exhibit's concluding text reads, "The case of Victoria Hayes reminds us that our community was touched by forces far beyond our understanding. It challenges us to think deeply about identity, memory, and trust. Most importantly, it honors all those whose lives were disrupted by Project Trinity, the Mitchell sisters who lost their individuality, Sarah Donnelly who lost her authentic past, and the Burlington community whose trust was exploited in service of national security. For Burlington residents, particularly those old enough to remember the original disappearance, the case remains a frequent topic of conversation. Coffee shop discussions still debate aspects of the story. Newer residents are often regaled with the tale by longtime locals who remember when Victoria worked at the library or when the whole town searched for her missing body. It's become part of our town's identity, noted current Burlington Mayor Emma Richardson. We're the place where one of the strangest Cold War operations unfolded. It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happens elsewhere. It happens right here in small towns to ordinary people who get caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Lessons for cold case investigation. The methodologies that cracked the Victoria Hayes case have been adopted by cold case units nationwide. Detective Kovach's approach, combining genetic genealogy with a willingness to consider unprecedented scenarios, has become a model for investigating seemingly unsolvable mysteries. The Victoria Hayes case taught us to question our assumptions, explained FBI Special Agent Thomas Rivera, who now leads the Bureau's cold case division. We're trained to think in certain patterns: one victim, one perpetrator, linear cause and effect. But some cases require us to completely reimagine the fundamental nature of what happened. Could the victim actually be multiple people? Could the crime scene have been deliberately staged by the victim? Could government operations be involved in ways that were classified at the time? This mindset has led to breakthroughs in several other cold cases. Investigators now routinely consider whether unusual disappearances might have intelligence operation explanations. DNA analysis is conducted with awareness that unusual genetic patterns might indicate siblings operating as a single identity. Records are searched not just for the victim but for potential government programs that might have been operating in the area. The case has also influenced how law enforcement approaches witness testimony and memory. The revelation that Margaret's memories were artificially implanted has reinforced skepticism about the reliability of eyewitness accounts and recovered memories, leading to more careful evaluation of testimony in both cold cases and active investigations. The philosophical impact. Beyond its practical implications for law enforcement and intelligence oversight, the Victoria Hayes case has provoked serious philosophical inquiry into the nature of identity and personhood. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a philosopher at the University of Vermont who has written extensively about the case, argues that it challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between identity and body. We typically assume a one-to-one correspondence between bodies and persons, Morrison wrote in her 2021 book, The Case of the Multiple Self. Victoria Hayes disrupts that assumption. 3 bodies inhabited one social identity so successfully that even people who interacted with Victoria regularly didn't notice. This suggests that identity is more about social performance and recognition than about individual bodies. In a meaningful sense, Victoria Hayes was real, a person who existed in the social world, who had relationships and made impacts, even though that person was constituted by 3 different biological individuals. The case has also prompted reflection on the ethics of memory and the role of personal history in identity formation. If Margaret's false memories shaped her into a person who devoted her life to searching for her cousin, can we say those memories were entirely false? They had real effects, they generated genuine emotions, and motivated real actions. This case forces us to reconsider what we mean by authentic identity, noted Dr. James Chen, a psychologist specializing in memory. Margaret's memories of Victoria weren't based on actual events, but the person she became because of those memories was entirely real. Which matters more, the objective truth of our past or the subjective reality of how we experience and respond to our memories? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have practical implications for how we understand recovered memory therapy, witness testimony, and even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Where are they now? As we near the end of this incredible story, it's worth checking in on where the key figures are today. The Mitchell sisters continue living together in their coastal Maine home. Now in their late 70s, they spend their days enjoying simple pleasures, gardening, cooking meals together, taking walks along the beach. They've reconnected with distant relatives from the Mitchell family who had lost track of them decades ago. They occasionally consult on cold case investigations, but mostly prefer their privacy. In a 2024 interview, Evelyn reflected, "We gave most of our lives to serving our country in ways it will never publicly acknowledge. Now we're just 3 old ladies trying to enjoy whatever time we have left. We have each other finally, and that's enough." Sarah Donnelly Hayes, Margaret, continues her advocacy work through the Project Trinity Accountability Foundation. She has helped identify and support 23 additional victims of the program and has been instrumental in pushing for further declassification of program documents. She still lives in Burlington, in a house not far from where she spent decades searching for Victoria. "Burlington is home," she explained in a recent interview. "My memories here may be built on false foundations, but the community I've been part of for 50 years is real. These are my people. My place. I'm not leaving." Detective Sarah Kovach leads the FBI's Cold Case and Historical Crimes Unit, applying lessons from the Victoria Hayes case to other seemingly unsolvable mysteries. She lectures regularly at law enforcement academies about thinking creatively in cold case investigation. "Victoria Hayes changed my career and changed how we approach cold cases," Kovach said. "It taught me that the answer to what happened might be something no one has ever considered before. That lesson applies to every unsolved case." Former handler Walter Morrison completed his house arrest sentence and now lives in a retirement facility in Virginia. He has declined all interview requests and maintains that he was following orders in service of national security objectives that were appropriate for their time. The Vermont State Police maintain an active cold case unit that continues to investigate potential Project Trinity-related disappearances. They work closely with federal agencies and share information with cold case units in other states where similar operations might have occurred. Final thoughts: the story of Victoria Hayes, of the Mitchell triplets, and Sarah Donnelly, and all those touched by Project Trinity, reminds us that reality can be stranger and more complex than any fiction. It reveals how far governments went during the Cold War in the name of national security, often with little regard for the human cost of their operations. It challenges us to think carefully about the nature of identity, memory, and truth. Are we who we think we are? Are our memories reliable guides to our past? Can a person who never existed still be real in the ways that matter? Most importantly, it stands as a testament to persistence. Margaret spent 47 years searching for someone who didn't exist, but that search led to the truth. Detective Kovacs refused to accept that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and her determination exposed a hidden chapter of American history. Every unsolved case deserves our best effort, Kovacs said in her closing remarks at a 2023 cold case conference. Every victim deserves justice, even if that victim was never quite who we thought they were. Every family deserves answers, even if those answers are more complex than anyone imagined. The cherry-red Volkswagen Beetle that started it all sits in the Vermont Historical Society Museum, a tangible reminder of a September morning in 1972 when a car was found abandoned and a mystery began that would take nearly half a century to solve. Visitors to the exhibit often pause at the final display panel, which poses a question to everyone who passes. What mysteries might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right technology and the right determined investigator to reveal them? It's a question worth pondering, because if Victoria Hayes taught us anything, it's that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how carefully concealed, has a way of eventually emerging into the light. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most extraordinary cold cases in American history. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed me, please subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who loves true crime that challenges everything we think we know. Drop a comment below. What other cold cases do you think might have explanations we haven't even considered? What mysteries are still waiting for someone to ask the right questions? Remember, every unsolved case is someone's tragedy, someone's unanswered questions, someone's search for truth. These stories matter, these victims matter, and sometimes if we're patient and persistent and willing to think beyond the conventional, we can bring light to even the darkest mysteries. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop questioning. The truth is out there, waiting to be found.